When looking through a family photo, chances are you've instinctively searched for the features you share with your relatives. Maybe you inherited your father's nose, your mother's smile, or a few little habits that are unmistakably your grandfather's. There is something deeply powerful about blood ties, an invisible bond that connects us across generations. But what happens when that bond is tied too tightly? Today, incest and close-kin marriage are widely considered taboo, both legally and morally. Yet, if we travel back just a few centuries, the world operated by a very different set of rules. From remote villages to the most powerful royal dynasties, marriages between people of the same bloodline were not viewed as wrong. In many cases, they were seen as the most sensible choice. Sometimes they were the only choice society truly approved of. Today, thanks to modern genetics, we know that such unions can unintentionally concentrate harmful mutations and pass them on to future generations. But why didn't our ancestors realize this? These were people who were remarkably intelligent and highly attuned to the demands of survival. So, how did they view love, family, and bloodlines in a way that led them to make decisions we now consider a mistake? Imagine that your body, just like the body of every person alive, is built from two enormous instruction manuals. One copied from your father, the other from your mother. Now and then, a few pages in those manuals contain printing errors. But nature is surprisingly clever. If page 10 inches your father's manual is damaged, while page 10 inches your mother's copy is perfectly intact, your body simply uses the healthy version as a backup. The child grows up healthy, never realizing that a hidden flaw exists within their DNA. That's why many of us can carry harmful mutations our entire lives without ever developing a disease. But what happens when the father and mother are siblings, or closely related by blood? Because they share the same ancestry, the chances of both carrying errors on the exact same page become dramatically higher. And when those matching errors meet, there is no healthy copy left to compensate. Once too many faulty pages pile up with no way to correct them, genetic disorders begin to emerge. What was once hidden suddenly becomes visible as birth defects, inherited illnesses, and severe developmental problems. Scientists call this the expression of recessive genes. In simple terms, inbreeding does not create new genetic defects. It merely forces the defects already hiding in the shadows to step into the light. Throughout history, this genetic lottery has played out everywhere, from remote valleys to the highest levels of power. Tens of thousands of years ago, archaeologists studying the DNA of ancient Neanderthal remains uncovered a striking pattern. Their genomes contained unusually high levels of inbreeding and harmful mutations. Many of these prehistoric children were born with skeletal deformities, infected joints, and immune systems too weak to cope with the world around them. Some modern researchers have even suggested that long-term inbreeding may have contributed to a large-scale genetic decline, one of the factors that ultimately pushed the Neanderthals toward extinction and left the planet. To our own ancestors, the Homo sapiens. And when humanity entered the age of civilization, this genetic trap did not disappear. If anything, it climbed even higher, all the way to the top of society, hidden beneath the silk and gold of royal courts. Perhaps the most famous example in the Western world was the House of Habsburg. For centuries, members of the dynasty repeatedly married within their own bloodline. Generation after generation, a strange physical trait became increasingly pronounced. An unusually long, protruding lower jaw that eventually became so severe it interfered with eating and speaking. Today, history remembers it as the Habsburg jaw. By the time the dynasty reached Charles II of Spain, the consequences had reached their peak. He suffered from severe physical weakness, chronic health problems, and mental instability. Most importantly, he was unable to produce an heir. And so a dynasty that once dominated much of Europe came to an embarrassing end. Not through conquest, not through revolution, but through the simple absence of a successor. Yet, if the Habsburgs were crippled by a deformed jaw, the cost paid by the rulers of ancient Egypt was even more devastating. Take Tutankhamun, perhaps the most famous pharaoh in history. For thousands of years, he was portrayed as a powerful king, a living god on earth. But when modern CT scans and DNA analysis peeled back the mystery behind his golden funerary mask, the truth shocked the world. The pharaoh was, in reality, a 19-year-old young man trapped inside a severely damaged body. He walked with a cane because of bone degeneration in his foot. He suffered from a cleft palate, congenital spinal deformities, and an immune system so fragile that even a relatively mild malaria infection may have contributed to his death. As it turns out, this living god was the product of a marriage between Akhenaten and his own sister. The genetic curse had transformed rulers who claimed divine status into children born with bodies already working against them, a patchwork genome with little room left for error. But the scars of inbreeding were never confined to royal palaces. Even today, they can still be found in isolated communities scattered across the globe. Remote tribes, mountain valleys cut off from the outside world, tiny islands surrounded by vast oceans. In many ways, these places have become nature's own laboratories for this harsh game of probability. In isolated regions of the Middle East and among certain island populations in the Pacific, marriages between close relatives persisted for generations, sometimes for centuries, sometimes for millennia. The results have left clear marks in the medical record. There are villages where complete color blindness, where people see only shades of black and white, occurs at extraordinarily high rates. Other communities experience levels of congenital deafness or hemophilia dozens, even hundreds of times higher than the global average. For many families, it becomes a tragic cycle. Children are born with inherited disorders. They marry within the same limited gene pool, and the burden is passed on once again to the next generation. Looking at this trail of evidence stretching from the distant past to the present day, one big question remains. Did people back then realize what was happening? For most of human history, the answer is simple: not at all. In an age before modern medicine, people viewed the world through a much simpler lens. Infant mortality was incredibly high. A child being born and dying a few months or a few years later was a common tragedy in almost every family. People blamed everything imaginable: seasonal diseases, malnutrition, accidents, or even a minor infection during childbirth. And remember the genetic lottery we talked about earlier. A child born from a close kin marriage would not necessarily be born with visible defects. Many grew up perfectly healthy. It was this randomness that concealed the truth. When a child was born sick or deformed, people blamed curses from the gods, evil spirits, or simple bad luck. Few would have suspected that the real cause was the very blood shared by the parents. That said, human intuition was not entirely blind. Over the centuries, some ancient cultures began noticing that something strange seemed to happen when close relatives had children together. They couldn't explain it scientifically, but they could see the pattern: weak children, recurring illnesses, the same problems appearing again and again. That is why laws against incest and marriage within the same family gradually appeared in places such as the Roman Empire and within the ancient traditions of Confucian societies in East Asia. People began to fear an invisible force, a punishment imposed by nature itself, even though they had no biological explanation for it. Yet despite those growing suspicions, close-kin marriage continued for centuries. Because people of the past were trapped behind 3 powerful walls, they simply could not escape. Imagine being born into a small tribe isolated deep within a forest. Your entire life unfolds among the same mountains, valleys, and caves. There are no roads, no vehicles, no internet. The number of people you might ever meet is limited to a few dozen members of your own community. In that world, finding a partner from an unrelated bloodline may be impossible. Inbreeding was not a choice. It was often the only way for the group to survive. That was the first wall: geography and poverty. But even when humanity entered the age of great civilizations, where strangers were everywhere, another barrier emerged: religion and belief. Consider the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. They viewed themselves as earthly manifestations of the sun god. In their mythology, the gods themselves often married their own brothers and sisters to preserve divine purity. So, if kings wished to prove that they were different from ordinary people, they had to imitate the gods. They believed royal blood must remain perfectly pure, untouched by what they considered the mud of the outside world. And, beyond faith, stood an even more powerful force: power itself, and wealth. For European royal families and ancient ruling dynasties, marriage was rarely about love. It was a political transaction. Think about it. Marry a daughter into another family, and half your land, influence, and treasure could eventually pass into someone else's hands. Marry within the family, and everything stays exactly where it is: the throne, the gold, the territory, the power. From their perspective, it was the perfect solution. And so they made a bargain. They gambled with the health of future generations in exchange for power in the present. For centuries, they continued down that path, blindly, until the consequences finally began to speak for themselves. The protruding jaws, the fragile bodies, the sickly heirs who died young. One by one, the warning signs became impossible to ignore. And that was when the gamble came to an end, bringing some of history's most glorious dynasties to a humiliating and bitter collapse. It took humanity thousands of years of stumbling through the dark to finally find the key to this brutal game of chance. The first breakthrough came in the 19th century, inside the quiet garden of a monastery, where the scientist Gregor Mendel patiently crossbred pea plants. From those experiments came Mendel's laws of inheritance. For the first time, they revealed the existence of dominant and recessive traits. Humanity began to glimpse a hidden truth. Some characteristics may never appear on the surface, yet they can still be passed from one generation to the next. But the real curtain did not fall until the 20th century, when the double helix structure of DNA was finally discovered. At last, science could explain mysteries that had puzzled people for centuries. The jaw of King Charles II, the suffering hidden within the body of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, and countless other tragedies scattered throughout history. More importantly, it provided the evidence behind the laws that now restrict close-kin marriage in most modern countries. Looking back, inbreeding resembles an invisible curse, a heavy price humanity paid whenever it tried to defy the rules of nature. Whether it was done to preserve a bloodline in an isolated valley or to protect a royal throne in its chests of gold, the outcome was often the same. In the end, human ambition always bowed before the power of biology. Because nature does not care about crowns. It does not care about noble bloodlines. And it certainly does not care about political schemes. Nature follows only its own laws, strict, unforgiving, and remarkably fair. When we try to seal a bloodline in order to preserve wealth and power, the only thing we truly preserve is decline.